Welcome to the Reformanda Initiative podcast, where we analyze and discuss Roman Catholic theology and practice from an evangelical point of view. Clearly, I am not your communications director, Clay Kennard, but instead the associate director, Reed Carr. Clay and his family are preparing to head to the U.S. tomorrow for the summer, so we'll be missing him, so I'm filling in for him right now. And I am joined, however, with Leonardo de Chirico, the director of the Reformanda Initiative. Leo, you haven't been with us the last couple episodes as we had guests join us, so it's good to have you back.
Thank you, Reed. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And today we're actually have another treat for our listeners. We have another special guest. We've enjoyed having these conversations with friends and guests of the Reformanda Initiative. And this time we will be speaking with Rachel Ciano, who is a longtime friend of the Reformanda Initiative. In fact, she's been there since the beginning of our the Rome Scholars and Leaders Network that we host each summer. We haven't been able to the last couple of summers, unfortunately, due to obvious reasons. But Rachel's a good friend of ours, a great contributor to the Reformanda Initiative. And Rachel, it is wonderful to have you with us this morning, and we appreciate your time.
So good to be here with you.
So Rachel, other than being, of course, a good friend of ours and contributor to the Reformanda Initiative, is a lecturer of Christianity and history at the Sydney Missionary and Bible College in Sydney, Australia. And what we'll do is we'll post a link to her bio, if she's okay with that, in our episode notes so that you can get a little more familiar with Rachel and see her many publications and projects that she's been a part of. And more importantly, Rachel is the wife to Ross, who is a pastor. And together they have two sons, 6 and 10. And you don't actually live in Sydney, correct? Maybe a suburb of Marrickville, is that correct? So
That's correct.
How far is that from Sydney? Is that just a suburb you drive in from out of the city a little bit to work?
So in Sydney, we call it the Inner West. So it's pretty close to the centre of Sydney and also near where I work in Croydon. So I can see the city right now from my office at work. It's lovely.
Okay, excellent. Give our listeners a frame of reference for where you are. Today, we asked Rachel to join us because she's going to help us discuss an extremely important figure in Christian history, and that is Augustine, or Augustine. We were talking before how to pronounce it, so we're going to interchange the pronunciation or the emphasis on his name and go with whatever comes out. But Rachel recently contributed to a book, an interesting book called 10 Dead Guys You Should Know. Many important figures throughout church history, starting in the early church and going all the way up. I think maybe the last one is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but I could be wrong on that, but up to modern day. And Rachel, you contributed a chapter on Augustine, Thomas Cranmer, and is there another one? Or
also Richard Baxter, yes, and Hudson Taylor.
Okay, so a significant contribution to this book. We'll also put a link to that in our episode notes so you can check it out. One thing I really appreciate about the book is it made each of these important figures very approachable, and the writing is very clear and easy to follow and to understand. In fact, Augustine, I think for myself in the past, and probably for many of our listeners, is this type of giant theological figure in church history that is so big and was around so long ago that he's very intimidating, and just hearing his name kind of makes you think that he's kind of unapproachable, unrelatable, irrelevant to the church history, to the church today and our lives. But one thing that you did in your chapter on Augustine, Rachel, which I really appreciate, is you really made him very approachable. And, really he's not that way. And in fact, Confessions, one of his most famous contributions to the church, is a very approachable book. It's kind of a journal, really, of his own story. But I thought before handing it over to you, Rachel, I'll just read a quick excerpt from your chapter on Augustine, which does a great job at making him very approachable. And you wrote, the humble pair is usually reserved for mushed baby food, decorative food bowls, or at their most elegant, still life paintings. But for Augustine, pears were the substance of momentous personal regret that would set him on a trajectory towards becoming one of the most influential theologians in the life of the church. As a boy, probably as a teenager, he and his friends used to run about, mucking about, and generally looking for trouble. One evening, while out on one of their adventures, they spotted a pear tree full of fruit. Augustine tells us they didn't want to eat them as they weren't hungry, and besides, they had better ones at home. Nevertheless, they shook the tree so the pears would fall, and they collected up a huge score of them. But what were they going to do with a massive load of pears that they didn't want to eat? Well, they went off to throw them at the pigs, of course. So immediately we feel a little bit more comfortable with Augustine and realize, he's just a boy at one time, just like all of us, and someone we can relate to. But tell us a little bit about his life in general and who he was, Rachel.
Well, he certainly did live a very colourful life, and I'm fascinated by him. So he's born in the mid-4th century, so 354, in the Roman Empire, but in the North African part of it, so a little bit on the fringes, seen as a bit of a backwater place. His dad's very stern. He's not a Christian, his father. His mum is softer, and she is a Christian. She's also very prayerful for her son. But from a really young age, it's clear that Augustine is very bright. And so he is educated very well. His father organises that for him. And he is a great student. He's very curious, he's intelligent, he's articulate. He has a general energy and drive about him. So I do resonate with you, Reed, when you said he's intimidating. He seems to have energy that I'll never obtain in this life. He takes up a position after his studies as the professor of rhetoric in Milan. Now, that sounds a bit odd, but essentially he's a speech writer. That's his job. So he goes to Milan to do that work, and that's going to be the place where he has a conversion experience. As you read that excerpt before, he did lead quite a colourful life in his teenage years, for want of a better word. So he had a long-term mistress for quite a while. He has a child with her but doesn't marry her. And he's also involved in petty theft and crime with his friends. But by the time he gets to Milan, he's having a sense that he's not enjoying the sin inside him. So when he's in Milan, he goes along to hear the bishop preach, Bishop Ambrose. And first he goes along just to get some pointers on how to preach. He's a speech writer, so he thinks he'll get some top tips for speaking. And he's quite impressed by hearing Ambrose preach from the Bible, and particularly how he deals with the Old Testament. Because up to that point, Augustine had been involved in a group called the Manichees. They're a bit of a dualistic sect. Their body is evil, the spirit is good, which means you can sin and it not affect the body. Very dangerous and in no way fulfilling. And Augustine is feeling that. And the Manichees also mishandled and really didn't use the Old Testament very well. So when Ambrose preaches from the Old Testament, Augustine, he's drawn to the scriptures. And during his time in Milan, he tells us of his conversion experience, and he actually writes it down in his confessions books. So he is in a garden. He hears children playing a game, saying, "Take up and read, take up and read." He does what we say we shouldn't do when we are studying the Bible, and he just flops it open and looks at the first passage there. And the passage he comes across is Romans 13:13, and it's an appeal to holy living. It's the answer to the problem of his sin, which he dislikes but has no solution for. And Romans 13 says, "Let us behave decently as in the daytime, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy." And that clinches it for Augustine. And he writes, "In an instant, as I came to the end of the sentence, it was as though a light of confidence flooded into my heart and all the darkness of doubt was dispelled." So that was the moment really for him that changed his life. From there on, he wants to have a quiet life of study. That's not going to happen. He's soon ordained and later made a bishop in North Africa, in the city of Hippo, it's called. Again, not a very impressive place for an impressive man who's held such a prestigious position as the professor of rhetoric in Milan. But he takes that position amidst much tears. He cries at his ordination as bishop. And so he remains in that city of Hippo until the end of his life, as he lays dying at the age of 75. So it's 430 AD by that stage. Gothic tribes are invading, the Roman Empire is falling, and as he dies, surrounded by the penitential psalms, he can hear those invaders coming. But he remains in that city the rest of his life, preaching, loving the people, doing a really good job, I think, of a local pastor there. And during that time, that's when his writing and particularly trying to defend his congregation, but Christians across the empire, from what he perceives to be false and dangerous teaching. He wants to protect them as their pastor. And so he enters into a number of engagements with various sects and heresies. Some are better known than others. Probably his best known one is his interaction with Pelagius and his followers.
What year was it that he became the professor in Milan?
He became a professor of Milan. He travelled to Milan in 384 AD. So he's converted at about the age of 32.
Right, which is it had been quite a while at that point, but which is a very significant time, at least in Christianity, because in the same century in 313, the Emperor Constantine had signed the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity, it went from being a persecuted religion to a accepted religion, and even one that created advantage for many people, which would come into the play with Pelagius. But so it was a very, very important time in history. Not only did you have the Edict of Milan being signed, but you also had, as you just mentioned, the Roman Empire being invaded. So he lived in a very interesting and tumultuous time. But why has Augustine become such an influential and important figure in Christianity? What about his theology made him such a major theologian?
He's a major theologian partly by the fact he was such a sharp thinker, also because he wrote a lot. Soon after he died, someone surveyed the books he'd written in his house and said, if anyone claims they've read all of these, he's a liar. So he just wrote and wrote and wrote. So partly it's the sheer volume of his work, but he makes really important contributions to the theology of the church in many areas, but two that really stick out to me are his contributions to the understanding of church and his contributions to the understanding of God's grace and how that is obtained by a person. So they're the two areas that I think he stands out for: doctrine of church, doctrine of grace.
What would be the specific characteristics of his doctrine of church and grace that stick out or that have endured over the years and the centuries?
So his doctrine of the church, he largely inherits from his predecessors, but he gives it precision and vitality. Essentially what he's passing on is the understanding that there's no salvation outside the church. Now, at a time when there is one Catholic Church in the 4th and 5th centuries, that makes sense. That's something that needs a little bit more nuance to understand today what he means by that. And he particularly hammers out his understanding of church when he engages with the Donatists. So the Donatists were a North African breakaway sect. They wanted to create their own pure church, pure because their members had not been corrupted by sins that others had committed during the age of persecution before that Edict of Milan and persecution died down. So they wanted to maintain the purity of the church. And Augustine says, no, you don't go off and start your own thing. The church is here and you need to be part of it. And
how does he relate it to his doctrine of grace?
So when he comes to talk about his doctrine of grace, he is going to say that it is much more, I guess we would say, evangelical understanding of grace, that it is God's grace alone that will save us. And what B.B. Warfield does, interestingly, actually, he says that what Augustine does is bequeaths us, the church, with a problem that takes almost 1,000 years for the church to solve. And the problem is his picture of church versus his picture of grace. So B.B. Warfield says, and I agree with him, that it's Augustine that gives us the Reformation, because the Reformation, inwardly considered, was just this is B.B. Warfield's words, was just the ultimate triumph of Augustine's doctrine of grace over his doctrine of the church. So B.B. Warfield postulates that if Augustine had lived longer and written more, his doctrine of grace would have superseded his doctrine of the church.
He talks about Augustine having two babies in his womb, and
yes.
two twins, so to speak, and but the doctrine of grace, in his view, prevails over the doctrine of the church. And of course, this is disputed by Roman Catholic readers who tend to say the opposite, that the doctrine of the church prevails over the doctrine of grace.
In light of that, you mentioned earlier, Rachel, the Pelagian controversy, which was probably one of the more well-known debates or controversies that Augustine was involved in, although he was involved with a lot, but this was one of his more well-known ones, and the debates still carry on to this day. I do appreciate the quote that you referenced in your chapter that you contributed to the book, and is actually a description of Pelagian from Jerome, who was a contemporary of Pelagius, and Jerome had to say this about Pelagius. He said that he was a huge, bloated alpine dog weighed down with Scottish oats, with a waistline not quite in keeping with the monastic lifestyle. So not a very endearing or flattering introduction to Pelagius, but tell us a little bit about him and what the controversy was and why it's so important.
Well, Jerome and Augustine were friends, at least pen pals. And so perhaps Jerome was tempted to side with Augustine on that one in painting that portrait. So Pelagius, what he taught, largely he was reacting to the lack of holiness that he saw entering the church. So after Christianity is tolerated in the Edict of Milan in 313, what enters the church is a whole lot of nominalism. So people that are happy to own the name of Jesus, but certainly not live a lifestyle that honours him. And so Pelagius looks at that, and that's detestable to him. And so his response to that is to encourage Christians to live a perfect life in keeping with God's law. So according to Pelagius, you are perfectly able to obey God perfectly. Sin does not corrupt the will, the decision to choose God or not. And so a person is entirely free to make decisions to obey God, and therefore we ought to obey God turns into the should. We should obey God. And so that means that he expects Christians to live a perfect life that they are capable of living a perfect life, And God's contribution to that is to encourage them through means of grace, the instruction of Jesus, help along the way, but it's certainly not a transformative grace that Augustine would understand.
One thing that we've discussed in depth here from day one with the Reformation Initiative is these two pillars, as we call them, on which the Roman Catholic theological system is built and relies upon. And those would be the nature and grace interdependence and the Christ Church interconnection. There's actually a question I'd like to ask to both you and Leo, as this has to do with also his area of expertise with his dissertation and the many years he's invested into that since then. But Rachel, how does the Pelagian controversy relate to that theological system that we just discussed, and highlight the specifics of it?
I'm going to defer to Leo first on this one because I'm curious for his answer.
Okay.
Well, as you said, Rachel, the Pelagius's assumption is that the impact of sin on our will is present, is relevant, but not as defective as we would say the Bible teaches it to be, and not impactful as Scripture teaches us the way it is. So it's not radical, it's not totally corruptive, but partially so. And in the end, always remaining the platform, the springboard out of which grace can then operate. So there is something that lies there at the bottom of our own will that makes it the ground for grace to be infused and to then begin his changing transformation of it. So it's, I think, the not accepting the radical nature of sin and the totally corruptive impact of our sin on our will. And that impacts the view of nature, whereby nature is only something that is added, infused, in order for this weakened will to be reinforced, strengthened, but not regenerated, not taken from death to life.
Yes, exactly. And whereas I think Augustine would say that we're included in Adam and Eve's sin at the fall, Pelagius is going to reject that. And so that means, yes, there's something in human beings that is capable of receiving grace, often through nature. Yes, through nature. And that seems at odds with a view of original sin that says that we are totally corrupt, which is where Augustine's going to land in his discussions with Pelagius.
So Pelagius took the view that you were not born into sin, but you became a sinner once you sinned, whereas, if that's correct, and then Augustine took the approach that no, the more biblical approach, as we would hold it, that we're born into sin and we inherit the sinful nature of Adam, so that we are born sinners, and which has, as you've both said, a tremendous impact on how we view our ability to work towards or contribute to our own salvation. And if we believe that we're born good, but then only become bad once we sin, then there's inherent goodness in us. Whereas the other says that no, we're born corrupt, and we are corrupt and remain corrupt until God does a work in our hearts and opens our eyes to the truth. As Paul says to the Corinthians, that the things of the Spirit are silliness and folly to us, and we cannot comprehend them until He gives us spiritual eyes to do so. So the impact and implications are tremendous for how we view sin, as we've said all along, and the implications are tremendous. And Pelagius adopted a view of sin that we would disagree with, and Augustine had more of a view on sin that is more evangelical in nature. So just kind of wrapping up our conversation with you, Rachel. So just kind of summarizing for our listeners and having a good understanding of Augustine for the church today. How should evangelicals, since this podcast views these things from an evangelical perspective on things, how should evangelicals appreciate Augustine? Are there any areas that they should approach him with caution? And what about the Roman Catholic interpretation of Augustine has endured today?
So I think where Augustine is of most encouragement to us today is around his doctrine of grace, and so we've talked about that, and tied in with that his view of original sin, because if we don't believe that we are totally corrupt, then there's not as much need for God to intervene in such a radical way with his grace. So the two are connected. Where I think we need to be aware of tricky bits that are our inheritance from Augustine around his idea of the sacraments. So he does define the sacraments as the visible sign of an invisible grace. The Roman Catholic Church is going to build on that and say that the church contains and communicates the invisible grace that the sacrament signifies, and in that sense, the church is a sacrament. And because Augustine does operate in a world where he's influenced by Neoplatonism, essentially Platonism was all about the journey to the one. The main idea, I think, to get from it for Christian theology is the understanding of form and accidents, so the actual substance of something and what it can become. We see that particularly, say, in transubstantiation, where the substance is changed to be wholly Christ, but the accidents remain, the bread and the wine. And so around the sacraments, we need to be aware of Augustine's influence as he brings something of a Platonic worldview to his understanding of those. So when he comes to talk about baptism, he says that the word is brought to the material element, so that's the water, and it becomes a sacrament. So that very much reflects the nature-grace interdependence that I know you've talked about previously on your show. But so the water possesses the capacity for grace, and as grace must be conveyed concretely through nature, through the water becomes a channel, a means of grace. And so you have the sacrament of baptism in the Catholic Church is understood as a means of grace, of actually affecting what it is claiming to do. It is actually cleansing from original sin.
Yeah, that's very true. Thank you, Rachel. I was also thinking of his treatment of justification and in a way, the way he models or blurs the distinction between justification and sanctification by presenting justification as a infusion of grace, gradual, progressive infusion of grace, and therefore making it not a juridical, forensic pronouncement, but rather an ongoing journey of transformation that has also been very influential in Roman Catholic developments in understanding justification. And the Reformers, while standing on the shoulders of Augustine, in terms of his doctrine of grace, would also redefine biblically the doctrine of justification, has located it in the divine pronouncement, and not so much in the inner transformation. That is, of course, another part of God's work in us, but biblically speaking, more related to the ongoing sanctifying work of the Spirit in the justified person. So that is also another area where Augustine can be not that helpful, so to speak.
Yeah. I was thinking too about the about Pelagius and his ideas. Now, if I'm not mistaken, they actually were condemned by the church. However, his ideas have continued to influence certainly Roman Catholicism, and at times, while you don't see it in evangelical theology, sometimes the day-to-day thinking, and of course, Roman Catholicism, where we see Pelagian ideas, is in, well, as we've already said, the high view of nature and man's capacity. Rachel, do you perceive any risk in for the evangelical church, while it may not adopt any form of his theology in a type of mentality or thinking? Is there any danger of it being present in our way of practicing our Christian faith? Sometimes, for example, we affirm that we're saved by God's grace alone, but we have a very works-based mentality a lot of times in how we approach day-to-day life.
Yeah.
Say what?
Yeah.
Yeah, how we approach the way we live the Christian life.
Right. Exactly. Is there any examples of that with Pelagian ideas?
I think definitely so. This is why I'm so interested in Augustine's writings against Pelagius and his followers, because I think this is the issue that as evangelicals we're most prone to get tripped up on. Even if it's not full-blown Pelagianism, we can adopt some of that into our thinking. So actually R.C. Sproul wrote, what would Luther think of the modern day heirs of the Reformation? My guess is that he would write on the modern church's captivity to Pelagianism. Mm. And what he meant by that is that the church today tends to view humanity as basically good. Mm. And if you view yourself as basically good, then cooperating with God in his grace is good enough to merit eternal life. Mm. And that just simply isn't the gospel. And I think, yes, in churches today, certainly where I am operating in Sydney, we preach a very robust doctrine of original sin. But somehow, our hearts being what they are, we can also convince ourselves that we're all right most of the time. Mm. And viewing ourselves in a Disney sort of framework where Disney sounds very much to me like Aquinas sometimes. Do what lies within you, you've got the heart, you've got the capacity, you have the skills within you, so do it. And we bring that into the church. We have the capacity to please God by ourselves, to operate in the world by ourselves. And I think that leads to a life where we're not dependent on God for his grace, his sustaining, his spirit-given gifts to enrich the church. And we become self-sufficient in a way that actually I think is an insult to God.
Yeah, thank you very much. Leo, would you add to that? Or
No, I think I totally agree with Rachel. Thank you very much for putting it in such a easy wording, but it's a great challenge for all of not only Australian evangelicalism, but even European and I would say global evangelicalism, holding on to a doctrine of justification on the one hand, but practically being very Pelagian in the outworking of our Christian lives and Christian paths.
Mm. And I would add to that as well that then when it comes to the works of righteousness that do come when we receive Christ, because where Christ is, there his Spirit is, and so we have the Holy Spirit regenerating us. If we take too much of a Pelagian worldview into us, then we're tempted to think that our works of righteousness are also self-driven and not done by the Spirit. And so then pastorally, our encouragement to someone struggling with sin is, I don't know if you say this in Europe, but pull your socks up, work harder, try harder. What's wrong with you? Just obey God. That's pretty much what Pelagius said. What's wrong with you? Just obey God. And so that's really pastorally insensitive, I think. We need to point people to the work of the Spirit in their lives to regenerate them. And it is a comforting doctrine rather than one that puts a rod on people's back. And sometimes in Sydney evangelical scenes as well, we can be tempted to think, yes, we're very certain that it's God's grace that saves us. What next? What do we do now? But actually, we don't ever move on from God's grace. It saves us and it keeps us in his kingdom. We never move on from that in the Christian life. So we should never tire of hearing that and ask, what's next? We simply grow in our understanding of the grace of God in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So oversimplifying things, what we've heard this morning, just from an evangelical perspective, Augustine was very strong on his doctrine of grace, not as strong on his doctrine of justification. In fact, it had to be redefined by the reformers. From a Catholic perspective, a lot of his reading and interpreting theology through the sacraments has been handed down and is referenced quite a bit. And so he's just like all the other church fathers, and strong in some areas, not as strong in others. And you have to approach him carefully and wisely, and which is always a challenge, but a good exercise. Anyway, Rachel, what resources would you suggest, one or two resources to our listeners if they want to learn a little bit more about Augustine?
I don't think you can go past Augustine's own words. So Confessions is a lovely starting point. If you haven't read that already, it's a fairly short read, and it's also a wonderful introduction to Augustine, because the first half really sounds like an evangelical conversion story, and the second half becomes something of a Catholic dualistic exposition. And so it will give you a wonderful taste of Augustine. He lived well before the Protestant Reformation, and so for him there's no categories of Catholic or Protestant. It's anachronistic. And so reading the Confessions will give you a lovely sense of what he's like, and it's a wonderful story of God's grace in his life. So I'd start there. Of course, you can read his short little chapter in 10 Dead Guys You Should Know. And I found Henry Chadwick on Augustine and Peter Brown on Augustine also really helpful as biographies.
Yeah, your chapter, I really enjoyed it. And we'll definitely, again, put the link to that book in our episode notes. And very readable, very approachable. I actually found the other day on my bookshelf, I had forgot that I even had it, was Peter Brown's biography on Augustine, which is a big book and not one that you're going to read overnight unless you're a speed reader. But there's lots of good resources, but Confessions is famous and very approachable as well. But Leo, before we conclude, would you have anything to add?
Oh, thank you, Rachel, for illuminating us with your research and wisdom and scholarship. It has been very important for us and for listeners to come across this great giant upon whose shoulders we are all put our foot. And as you said, Reed, we look. The reformers were conscious of standing on Augustine's theology, basically, and they would be happy to consider themselves as Augustinians. and so should we. Not uncritically so, not unwisely so. He was a man like all of us are, and we should go back to the scriptures in order for the Bible to be our ultimate authority. But Augustine is certainly a guide and a leader in the church that we must come across and learn from.
Yeah, Rachel, again, thank you so much for your time, and we're very appreciative of it. Look forward to the next time we're all together in Rome. And please say hello to Ross and your boys. Give our love to them. And Leo, thank you also for your contribution. It's been, very interesting, and it's always fun for me also to go over these giants of the church, as Leo said, and make them more approachable. That's something that I always try to work on myself. And so, Rachel, you've done a really good job of helping make Augustine more approachable for myself and for our listeners. So thanks so much. And again, we look forward to next summer.
Pleasure. See you soon.
Well, you can always check us out, as Clay always says, at reformandinitiative.org. I'm probably going to stop there. You can go back to other episodes and listen to all the ways you can follow us. So we appreciate your support and listening, and please give us a like on any podcast platform that you listen to us from. And until next time, God bless from Rome.